ready to come up here and speak. And he said, could I do something different? Could I sort of follow Doug Casey's idea of psychology and sociology and things like that? And why is it that people are so much against freedom? Why are they so socialistic in the bad sense, or communistic, or collectivistic in the bad sense? And I said I would try. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give one or two examples of Austrian economics, how this feeds into this egalitarianism nonsense, and then one or two examples from sociobiology, and then if I have more time, I'll go back to some of these more interesting questions, because I do want to honor my host. He invited me here, and I want to do what he thinks is best. And perhaps that heavy Austrian trip is more for students of economics, and most of you are not economics majors or might not be that interested in it. Okay. From the Austrian economics point of view, one of the fallacies, Austrian economics is not based on the economics of Austria. It's any more than Chicago economics is based on the economics of the city of Chicago. It's Austrian economics. It's called Austrian economics because the people who started it were from Austria. For instance, Menger, von Werk, Mises, Hayek. So let me give you one, and another thing that bugs me is when the Chicago school is seen as the free enterprise school and they ignore the Austrian school. The Chicago school are a bunch of compromisers. They're sort of like the Republican Party. They talk a good free enterprise, but when it comes down to it, they're not. So let me give you a technical Austrian insight that leads into what Giant asked me about why we have this egalitarianism or socialism in the bad sense. And what it is, it's called diminishing marginal utility of money. Diminishing marginal utility, a technical term, means that when you get the first apple or bottle of water, you use it, let's take bottles of water, you use it for the most important thing, namely to drink. When you get the second bottle of water, it has less value to you because you're using it just to wash yourself, and it'd be more important to drink than to wash yourself. And the third one, you water your garden, and the fourth one, you give water to something else. So there's diminishing marginal utility in the sense that if someone came up to you with a gun and said, give me a bottle of water, give me the bottle of water that you're going to use for drinking, well, you give them that bottle, but you don't stop drinking. You just take one of the bottles of water that had a lower marginal value to you, and now you shift it to drinking. So that's diminishing marginal utility of water. We have diminishing marginal utility of everything in the sense that the more you have of something, the less you value the next item in that occurrence. It's the same thing with the diminishing marginal utility of money. Namely, the first $1,000 you got saves you from starvation. The second 1,000 maybe saves you from something else, and the third 1,000, and when you get to the 100,000 or the last dollar of a millionaire, you start lighting up your cigars with $100 bills. So the idea is that there's diminishing marginal utility of money. These people also have another problem. They call it with utility. There is such a thing as cardinal and ordinal utility. Cardinal utility is counted. Like, I like this wristwatch more than this time, I like this time more than something else, a paper clip. That's okay. Austrians believe in ordinal utility. But then there's this thing called, what's the other one? Cardinal utility, where you count utils, where you say, well, this watch is worth 20 utils, and this tie is worth 10 utils, and therefore I value this watch twice as much. That's silly. And yet, the mainstream economists love doing this. Every time they put marginal utility on an axis, they have to give it a number, namely a counting number. It's not ordinal. Now, I realize I'm giving you some heavy technical economics, but I'm going to bring it back to what John had asked. So, not only do they have cardinal utility, but they have a thing that's even worse called interpersonal comparison of utility. Namely, I value this watch at 20 utils, you value this watch at 10 utils, therefore I value this watch twice as much as you. It's just silly. And so is it with money. So what you see, the idea is a millionaire, his last or marginal $1,000, he's just lighting up cigars with it, whereas the poor guy, it's the difference between life and death to him. And therefore, what we ought to do is take money from the rich and give it to the poor. because the last guy will only lose a few utils, whereas the recipient will gain tons of utils, and therefore economic efficiency will be promoted. That's their argument for egalitarianism. And the Austrian criticism of this is there ain't no cardinal utilities, and if there were, you can't compare them interpersonally. So that's just one example of how Austrianism impacts with this idea. Let me give you a thing called sociobiology, because in my view, sociobiology explains why we have only, what, 150 people here? In any just society, in any reasonable society, there'd be 20,000 people listening to this line of speakers. Instead, they listen to the former vice president and all these sociopaths that Doug was talking about. Why is it that we have so few people? Why is it that when Ron Paul ran for the Libertarian Party, he got the usual 0.5% of the vote? Why is it that the Libertarian Party in Canada is virtually unknown? Why is it that most people that we know, our cousins, our wives, our children, they're all a bunch of commies? You know, why is this? See, the point is that if we don't want to cavil into the TSA, we need lots of people. So it's very imperative to find out why we're so few. Why are we so few? One of them is envy. Helmut Schuck's Envy book. That the intellectuals are particularly drawn toward the regime, toward socialism or collectivism in a bad sense. Why? Well, according to Milton Friedman and Robert Nozick, and I think they did a good job here, when the intellectuals were in high school, they were getting A's in all the subjects, and then there was this guy getting a C, and he was the dummy. And afterward, they're now a professor of poetry or something, making $35,000 a year, and this guy who used to get the C, he runs a McDonald's thing. He owns a McDonald's franchise, and he's making a lot of money. Now, obviously, this is not fair, because they're smart and he's stupid, and yet it's due to capitalism, so capitalism must be bad. That's one explanation. I think that's a good one. Another explanation is sociobiology. What's sociobiology? Sociobiology is the theory that we are the way we are, we think the way we think, we are against freedom, most of us, 80% as Doug would say, because of biology, because we're hardwired for that. Let me give you a few examples of sociobiology. How many people here are afraid of snakes? Raise your hand. Come on, just a few. If there was a big snake running around, I don't know, I'd pull out a gun if I had one, or I'd panic, or grab a chair or something. Most people are afraid of snakes. How many people are afraid of bathtubs? Huh? Bathtubs? Why would anyone be afraid of a bathtub? Well, do you know that right now, many more people die of bathtubs than of snakes? So if you were sensible, if you weren't biologically hardwired, you'd be, if you were rational, you'd be more afraid of bathtubs than snakes. Milton Friedman died of a bathtub. What happened? He was 92 or 93. He slipped in the bathtub, he hit his head, and on the way to the hospital, he died. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Bathtubs are very dangerous. But we're not hardwired to be afraid of bathtubs. Why not? Because 1 million years ago, when we were in the trees or in the forest or wherever we were, there were no bathtubs. To be afraid of a bathtub in those days didn't give you any more chance to lead progeny than if you weren't afraid of a bathtub. It was just neutral. There were no bathtubs. But if you weren't afraid of snakes, if you go up and pat one, hi snakey, and how are things going, and shake hands, you didn't lead too many children. So we are the products of people who were afraid of afraid of snakes. We're hardwired to be afraid of snakes. Even though it doesn't help us, much now, whereas being afraid of a bathtub, being cautious around a bathtub would be much more helpful. Let me give you another one. A lot of actresses, they become 40, 50 years old, they're still beautiful, but they don't get the roles, the sex roles anymore. Now they have to be the mother or the grandmother or something, and they bitterly complain about it because we're sexist and pigs and all. Whereas 22-year-old girls get those actress roles. Now, suppose there were two tribes, and the reason for this is that we're hardwired, we men, to look at 22-year-old girls and say, whoop-de-doo, let me have them. Whereas a 50-year-old woman, no matter how beautiful, we're not as hardwired to grab them. Why is this sociobiological? Because imagine there were two tribes, us and the other guys, and we both had the same brain capacity,